Welcome to Human Monsters. To commemorate Mother's Day, I'm going to dedicate this episode to cases of filicide, that is, mothers murdering their children. Since I am not your son, and lingerie is really a gift for me, I will give this episode to you to mark the occasion. Mother number 1, Andrea Giesbrecht. What would you keep in a storage locker? Gym clothes? Non-perishable snack foods? Your knife collection? Winnipeg, Canada resident Andrea Giesbrecht had something else in mind. 6 babies. The purpose was to preserve them so that she would not have to get rid of them. Apparently, those companies that preserve baby shoes in copper don't extend the task to the rest of the body. Giesbrecht's C-student lawyer's biggest argument was that she didn't intend to throw them out with the garbage to be sorted and ground up into organics and used as fertilizer. The first dead baby gardening joke, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. She was sentenced to 8.5 years after being found guilty on 6 counts of disposing a body of a dead child with intent to conceal the delivery. To quote her lawyer, "If ditching the remains was her intention, she wouldn't have obtained a large, heated storage locker or prevented the contents from being auctioned off after she failed to make her payments. Oh yes, I forgot. It's the disposal part, not the murder part, that was wrong." The cause of death was not determined, though the defendant claimed the infants were stillborn. More evidence that her lawyer is insane. She may have had a facetious or not realistic expectation. She may have wanted to visit. She may have wanted to preserve them. She doesn't have to explain. All we have here is a rental locker and 6 dead babies. If you get caught with a storage locker filled with dead babies, better call Saul. Mother number 2, Manling Williams. Manling Williams had a life that many people dream of. She had a husband that loved her and 2 sons. They were a handful, to put it euphemistically. Kids are annoying, and they were no exception. She met her husband, Neil, while she worked a shift at a Subway restaurant. He would bear witness as she demonstrated her talent for swallowing a footlong. That was made up. This wasn't. They hit it off immediately and were soon joined at the hip. Manling became the woman of his dreams, and not just the type of dream that ends when you reach for a tissue and pull up your pants. Neil's friends and family had never seen him so happy. He acted like he actually remembered this chick's name, and it seemed to be legit. He thought she was breathtakingly beautiful. Was she? I'll put it to you this way. Somebody should have directed him from Subway to Lens Crafters. Neil Skywalker landed a direct hit on Manling's ovum, leading to a collision of genetic material inside a pocket of reproductive fluids and other gunk you probably wouldn't want to see. The couple got married soon after the pregnancy was discovered. Manling didn't wake up the day after the wedding to find Neil hanging from a slip knot, so it was a happy occasion. Things went well for the young family for a while. Manling got another job, one that paid better, so she wasn't completely worthless. Manling got pregnant again and managed to bring it to term without falling down the stairs or getting hooked on meth. That baby survived. Neil's mother was all too happy to babysit her infant grandsons, whose names were cursed and doomed. Just kidding. Their names were Ian and Devin. August 8th, 2007. Neighbors caught sight of Manling outdoors, where she was covered in blood and screaming for help. It occurred to them that something might be wrong. They contacted the police. When officers arrived, they entered the house and found Neil lying dead at the top of the stairs. She hadn't had time to slice assorted cold cuts from his body. However, she did manage to slice his neck and chest, 90 times with a sword. The police searched the rest of the house and found Ian and Devon in their beds. Initially, it seemed they were asleep. Upon closer inspection, they discovered that, within feet of the Johnson & Johnson No Tears shampoo, they had been smothered to death. Naturally, being the sole survivor, hysterical and covered in blood, the police brought Manling in for questioning. She demanded to know what had become of her husband and children. When they told her what happened to them, she suddenly grew quiet. Having shut the fuck right up, she tried pointing her finger in her husband's direction, even though he was neither present nor alive. She insisted he must have killed the children and himself. To emphasize her status as a victim, she mentioned a MySpace account she created where she wrote her suicide note. Apparently it didn't help with her anguish that Tom, the site's creator, was her first and remaining friend. In the note, she blamed Neil for the death of her children. Can you believe the investigators found this story hard to accept? Usually when people commit suicide, they don't find a way to cut their hands off. Most men go with a gun or a slipknot. It would also have been very awkward for him to stab himself in the back, where several sword wounds were found. Manling was charged with 3 counts of murder. She eventually confessed her guilt. Reportedly, as she told the story of how it happened, she was as cool as a cucumber, iceberg lettuce, tomatoes, and whatever else you would like on your sandwich. She was sentenced to execution, whereupon she will be as dead as Black Forest ham. If only Jared Fogle had banged her instead of underage girls, he would have had his sandwiches and his endorsement money. What's this? A cease and desist letter from Subway already? I haven't even finished recording. Mother number 3, Susan Eubanks. Susan Eubanks wanted to be happy, but attaining it proved to be a struggle. Welcome to the club, bitch. I wanted to direct films. I was going to make a Flash movie. Young people drink to party. Old people drink to cope. Life sucks, whore. Eventually you'll agree that it's okay to call Susan Eubanks a whore. She lived in financial chaos, hopping from penis to penis as the neighborhood passed along. She spent most of her money on booze because she probably didn't want to be Susan Eubanks either. Before she officially, legally became a Eubanks, she met Eric Eubanks. He was a kind and supportive man, and, like a typical woman in reaction to such a man, she would eventually tear his heart to pieces. Not that I can relate to Eric Eubanks. Anyway, she was delighted that he wanted to take care of her and her son. He supported them, and she loved him back. She felt like she had hit pay dirt and could feel happy about her life for once. During a relatively short courtship and engagement, they got married. During the ceremony, there were no time travelers from the future in attendance to raise objections when prompted to do so. If there had, they might have shot her, especially if they had been those pro-life people who support war and the death penalty. Over the next few years, 3 more sons made it 4. The marital bliss proved to be in short supply. The couple were fighting all the time. Perhaps he learned about her sexual history, handling more sausage than a Polish butcher. Herpes outbreak or not, Susan and Eric could not agree on anything, and he left their home. Papa was not a rolling stone. He was very much involved in his sons' lives. Eric initiated divorce proceedings, to which Susan was not amenable. Susan was tired of her relationships meeting the same fate as every campaign for world peace ever devised. Maybe if she hadn't been such a psycho-hosed beast. She couldn't have done all the yelling with a happy man's cock in her mouth, but clearly she read her dating advice in magazines whose pages were not stuck together. She fought back as Eric sought to dissolve the marriage and find a woman who wouldn't have to wear a straitjacket over her bridal gown. Susan was never good at managing her finances. She ran up $40,000 in credit card debt. Her life isn't even worth that much. She took odd jobs to support herself, though financially she was about as stable as she was when she was hit on your own brother drunk. Add an addiction to pain pills when she was already a pain in the ass to others, and she could barely function anymore. She was about as attractive in her utility as a broken-down, discarded alleyway toilet. She met a man named Rennie Dodson. To use a clumsy real estate analogy, she was a distressed property in need of being flipped, the kind with wild animals squatting inside. She had no resale value whatsoever, but he apparently was in the red self-esteem-wise, for he was willing to tolerate her. Whether or not he found an insect species in her panties that hadn't been identified yet, they enjoyed many good times together. He was fun and exciting, so she treated him with respect. He was also a drinker and fond of drugs. They were happy together, and he moved into her house. October 26th, 1999. Susan and Rennie went out and left her 14-year-old son in charge of the house. After all, when we want to find someone to take on responsibility, we all turn to a 14-year-old, don't we? His younger brothers and a cousin were home at the time playing video games. True to form, Susan was destroying her most recent relationship. There was always trouble when she took the dick out of her mouth. She didn't have to moan on it. It's nice to moan, but just keep it in there instead of hectoring the motherfucker. She could have gagged on it. That at least happens by accident most of the time. No matter what Rennie did, Susan was still a bitch. Fixing that would take a miracle. He wasn't a 1999 resurrected Jesus turning water into ice-cold Miller Genuine Draft. It seemed to Rennie that their days as an item were numbered, like their relationship was crab lice struggling to survive as it fled from crab shampoo and the tiny comb. Susan did everything she could to keep them together, except being a savage in the bedroom. She couldn't resist being a nagging biatch, and after another particularly nasty argument, Rennie had had enough and ran like the man who just discovered why the water in the jacuzzi looks like egg drop soup. Did Susan adapt to the breakup well? She didn't cut his dick off and throw it out her car's window, but she did throw his stuff around, cut the phone cords, and threaten him with violence. That bitch is crazy. Rennie felt threatened enough to walk to a store down the street and ask their clerk to call the police. During that call, Susan slashed 2 of the tires of his car. Yeah, that always gets him back. Eric happened to show up at the house at that time. Eric sympathized with Rennie, and after Rennie brought out his personal belongings, they drove to a bar. Once the men were at the bar, Susan called them and told Eric she was going to kill herself and the kids. Eric wouldn't have been as concerned if she only threatened suicide, but he feared for his kids' safety. He called the police and asked them to conduct a safety check at the house. Since it wasn't a matter of dragging her away from a glory hole, the police took it seriously. When the police arrived, they found that their efforts were poorly timed. 3 of the boys had been shot in the head. The oldest boy was found in the kitchen. He had been shot in the head twice. The other 3 were in a bedroom and playing video games when she killed them. 1 boy was found alive, him being the 5-year-old nephew of Susan Eubanks. He was not harmed. Susan was found with a self-inflicted gunshot in her stomach because crotch rot would have taken too long. She survived. Susan Eubanks was charged with the murders of her 4 sons. She pleaded not guilty. Her attorney went for an insanity plea, claiming she blacked out at the time she committed the murders. The prosecution countered by saying that if she had blacked out, she wouldn't have had enough sense to reload. The fact that she left her nephew unscathed also poked holes in the notion that she was not in charge of her faculties. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The gangbang of justice not only spooged a guilty verdict into her face, but recommended the death penalty, which she received. So far, She hasn't been able to fucking suck her way off death row. I've seen a picture of her. She's totally unfuckable. I wouldn't fuck her in Bluetooth mode. Mother number 4, China Arnold. China Arnold's dream was to have a baby girl. Not winning the $50 million Powerball, not world peace, not true love, a baby. That's easy. Raccoons do it. If you're the kind of woman who thinks that safe sex means to wear underwear on Saturdays, conception should not be a problem. Any woman with a vagina can get laid, and China got the baby girl she wanted, who was named Paris. She envisioned a childhood for the baby as being like that of a real-life Barbie doll. Pretty dresses, ribbons in her hair, no nipples, a future metrosexual boyfriend with no penis. Okay, back to the true part. China lived with her boyfriend Terrell Talley. They fought like cats and dogs. If they had fucked like cats and dogs, they wouldn't have spent so much time together and wouldn't have fought so much. They were, nevertheless, of the human species, and the relationship was as doomed as the Barbie McDonald's playset, which apparently enabled her to drive a Corvette and live in a Malibu mansion. Terrell accused China of cheating on him repeatedly. He should have cheated back. Would it have been morally right? That's debatable. Would it have felt right? Fuck yeah. It would have felt really right. Ultimately, it was revealed that he did cheat on her. Apparently, it felt right, too. He insisted on a paternity test so that they could find out if Paris was his child. He was convinced that every guy in town with an erection was using China as a dartboard. China was terrified of the paternity test. With supervision by Maury Povich and his staff, the situation would have worked out much differently. Instead of having the paternity test, China put Paris in a microwave. Oh, and she turned it on. The autopsy results suggested Paris was nuked for approximately 2 minutes. Her internal temperature reached 108 degrees Fahrenheit, or 42 degrees Celsius. In other words, the kind of summer temperature that kills residents of third world nations we don't care about. China brought Paris to the emergency room the next day because, according to her, timing isn't everything. The doctors were alarmed by the burns they saw all up and down Paris's body. When they asked China about it, she faked like she was ignorant to the implications of the burns. Normally, she didn't have to play dumb. Nobody was ever in doubt. Her credibility made her the Miss Cleo of motherhood. The doctors could not accept that she didn't understand that something serious had afflicted her child. You didn't need a medical degree to see it. You didn't even need reading glasses. The doctors diagnosed China as full of shit. Paris succumbed to her injuries and passed away. A paternity test revealed that Terrell Talley was the father. China was tried 3 times because of a lack of evidence. China's cellmate came forward and announced that China confessed to her that she put Paris in the microwave and cleaned the scene to erase all the DNA evidence. China was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. People who treat children like China treated Paris tend to find themselves at the wrong end of a shank in prison. One of these days, the dealers of jailhouse justice will invent a gun that shoots rape. Anyway, fuck that bitch. Mother number 5, Kenesha Berry. When's the last time you were taking a walk and passed by a dead baby on the side of the road? It happened to a man in 2003. The mother of the baby was Kenesha Berry, and the baby's name was Paris. So, now I know not to name my baby Paris. Baby Paris was taken to a hospital. His entire body was covered in ant bites and dirt. It took over a month for the baby to heal from his injuries during his time in hospital. The search for his mother was on, and nobody yet knew it to be Kenesha Berry, though she did soon become the prime suspect. This case was instrumental in solving a previous discarded baby case. A baby named Hope was found murdered in 1998. His body was wrapped in duct tape, stuffed into a garbage bag, and placed in a dumpster, where he succumbed to his injuries. The investigators could not figure out who the mother and perpetrator was, so the case went cold. The discovery of baby Paris implied that the same offender may have been involved in both murders. The babies were found in the same area. A pillowcase that was used to wrap Paris's body was thrown in the same garbage can where Hope was found. Barry turned herself in and confessed to both crimes. She was confirmed as the biological mother of both babies. As the background story goes, Kenesha kept the pregnancies a secret from both friends and family. She was 21 years old when Hope was born. She delivered the child herself at home with no assistance. She had 3 other children who were unharmed, which made these circumstances even stranger. She was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison plus 20 years for the murder of Paris. For her brand of baby mama drama, she'll be eligible for parole in 35 years. Mother number 6, Andrea Yates. Andrea Yates forgot to not drown each of one of her children in her bathtub and lay them each down on a bed afterwards to make it look like they were sleeping and highly resistant to waking. The case attracted a great deal of media focus, leading to her receiving voluminous amounts of hate mail and death threats. Mothers who decided to let their children live racked their brains to understand how a mother could commit such a crime. Even stranger was Andrea's background in comparison to her profile as a criminal. She was an honors student and graduated as a valedictorian. She went on to work as a nurse. Years later, Andrea complained of suffering from depression and experiencing suicidal thoughts. At the cancer center where she worked, she met Rusty Yates. They fell in love in short order and married in April 1993. As the children were born, her depression worsened. It was posthumously diagnosed as postpartum depression, though postpartum psychosis is another complication and likely a factor in this crime. Throughout the summer of 1999, Andrea attempted suicide 3 times. Even she knew her kids would be better off without her. She was observed behaving strangely, like when she would be seen rocking back and forth for extended periods of time. She engaged in self-harm, chewing and cutting herself, sometimes to the point that she required hospitalization. Psychiatrists determined that she should not have any more children. She was put on medication, which stabilized her to some degree. Bitch didn't keep her legs shut, and neither she nor her Christian husband used birth control because they believed it would be wrong to use it, because that's what morons believe. Andrea became pregnant for the 5th time. She stopped taking the medication, though she remained stable. Everything was going smoothly until her father died in March of 2001. Her mental illness was reactivated. She fell back into a pattern of self-mutilation, stopped feeding the kids, and became catatonic. She was admitted to hospital again. After she was released, a doctor advised Rusty against leaving Andrea alone with the children. June 20th, 2001. Rusty had to go to work, but his mother was due to arrive within the hour to help Andrea with the care of the children. After he left, Andrea ran a bath. She drowned John, Paul, and Ringo. Oh, just kidding. She drowned John, Paul, and Luke before laying them on the bed. She took Mary, who was an infant, into the bathroom and drowned her in the tub. When her son Noah came in, she drowned him. As he lay dead in the water, she held baby Mary in her arms. Having killed all the children, Andrea called the police. After calling the cops, she called Rusty to repeat the phrase, "It's over," several times. Rusty rushed over immediately and encountered the horrors at the scene. Incredibly, the state of Texas did not consider Andrea Yates to be insane. She was found guilty of murder on all counts and was sentenced to life in prison. 2005. A witness recanted their testimony, which was crucial to the prosecution. Andrea's conviction was overturned. She was permitted to be released on bail, provided she be booked into a psychiatric hospital, which she was. 2006, another jury found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity. She was remanded to a low-security psychiatric institution, where she remains. She requested the privilege of attending church services off campus. No dice. The one silver lining of this case was that it drew more attention to the phenomena of postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis, which now factors into a mother's postnatal care if necessary. Mother number 7, Darlie Routier. June 6, 1996, 2 a.m. Darren Routier woke to the sound of his wife screaming. It came from the living room. When he ran downstairs to investigate, he found that the living room looked like it had been lashed by a rainstorm of blood. Even more disturbing, both of his sons lay on the floor. Snapping out of shock, he told Darlie to call 911. He checked on the boys. 5-year-old Damon was still breathing, though with obstruction. 6-year-old Devin was not breathing. Darren performed CPR on him. Darlie told the 911 operator that intruders broke into the home and killed her sons. She also told them the intruder slashed her throat, failing to realize that it's difficult to speak when blood is flooding your throat. When the police arrived, they told Darlie to put a rag on Damon's wounds and apply pressure. She ignored their directives. She told them the intruder ran to the garage and was likely hiding in there. Paramedics attempted to save Damon, but he soon perished. Darlie had a superficial cut on her throat. The youngest child, a baby named Drake, was not harmed. The police failed to find the intruder in the garage. They found Darlie's purse in the kitchen with some expensive jewelry nearby. Those stabbed holes in the burglary allegation. They found a bloodied knife near the kitchen sink. When they brought it to Darlie's attention, she said she touched it when she found it, and they shouldn't be surprised to find her prints on the murder weapon. They were shocked that this was more of an issue to her than the deaths of her sons. She told them her version of the events. She was woken by a man who was standing over her. She said he climbed on top of her in an attempt at rape. After struggling with him for a few minutes, she screamed. He immediately dismounted and escaped through the garage. She said she only noticed at that point that her sons had been attacked and that she didn't hear the stabbings as they were underway. Not only did her story not add up, but though there was a slit in the screen of the window in her garage, it wasn't big enough to evacuate anything except a man's bladder. A crime scene expert determined that the living room appeared to have been arranged to make it look like a struggle had taken place. It didn't help Darlie's case that when she was presented with the body of her dead child while she was treated for the cut on her neck, she didn't react with any emotion whatsoever. She just stared into space. She was interviewed again months later, and her recall of events was very different. Her detachment while listing the details was also noted. This was not the be-all and end-all of Darlie's behavior. On what would have been Damon's 7th birthday, she held a party at his grave. She even asked a pastor to recite a sermon. As he did, she covered the grave in silly string, gum, and bubbles. Needless to say, her conduct shocked people. Amid the festivities, she said something that incriminated her. 4 days after the birthday party, she was arrested. Darren always believed that Darlie was innocent. After a few hours of deliberation, Darlie was found guilty of the murders. She was given the death penalty. She currently resides on death row in Texas. Mother number 8, Susan Smith. Are you familiar with the name Jerome Horowitz? Probably not. He was more commonly known as Curly, the most popular member of the Three Stooges. In case you think you're too good to watch the Three Stooges, He was an innovator when it came to slapstick comedy. People like Jim Carrey and Michael Richards owe a debt to him. Anyway, Jerome was in love with love. If a woman showed interest in him and the feeling was mutual, he would marry her right away. That would explain why he was married 4 times. She didn't shave her head and get slapped all the time, though as you shall soon see, she deserved to be in an abusive relationship with Mo Howard. She too would jump headfirst into relationships with anybody that wanted her. Curly needed a time machine. She thought she found her true love, but in order for that to be the case, the significant other has to feel the same way. But this man's feelings for her were not significant enough. The reason was she had 2 kids, and he didn't want to pay for another man's child's athletic equipment and jock itch formula. He wanted to fuck the mother, not get fucked by the kids. Susan decided that this man was more important to her than her only begotten sons, so the solution became clear to her. Susan's early life did not present many models of emotional stability. 5 weeks after her parents' divorce, her father committed suicide. Susan was so shaken by this event that the once happy and outgoing child became depressed and withdrawn. Soon after the divorce, her mother dated a man named Beverly. If you're a man and your name is Beverly, you probably have issues. Even with him being called Bev by everyone, this was true. Susan recovered from her early life trauma in high school and became a straight-A student who was popular. She also volunteered in the community. Unfortunately, Bev volunteered to take it upon himself to initiate Susan into sex by molesting her. She tried to report him a couple of times, but she was too apprehensive to press charges. Her mother was a reputation whore who was more concerned with maintaining a low profile for the family than with protecting Susan from sexual abuse. The result was that Bev was given carte blanche to abuse Susan. It became normalized to the point where Susan and Bev had a consensual, if inappropriate, affair. Susan also opened her gene pool to the public, dating 2 other men. One of them she met at work. He happened to be married and significantly older. The other one was closer in age. Susan became pregnant by variety penis, and she didn't know who the father was. This she could not abide. Enter the coat hanger. The next thing to die was her relationship with a married man when he broke up with her. She was unable to cope with the situation and tried to kill herself. Did she use the same coat hanger to stick into her ear and incur irreversible brain damage? No, that brain damage was congenital. Nobody knows how she tried to kill herself. While she was in the hospital, she admitted to staff that it wasn't her first suicide attempt. Hopefully she didn't confuse a janitor for somebody who might have given a shit. Did he wipe her tears with a J-cloth? Who knows? After graduating at the end of her stellar academic career in high school, Susan Smith began working at a supermarket. While working there, she began dating a coworker named David Smith. They became so close that David, engaged at the time, broke it off with the other girl to make the biggest mistake of his life. Susan became pregnant with David's child, and this checkout girl did not void the transaction this time around. Just before the wedding, his brother died instead of Susan because life is unfair. David's parents were devastated, with the father having killed himself and his mother moving out of town. Either one of them should have taken Susan with them. Tragically alive, Susan comforted David, since she had also experienced the death of a father and knew what to say. They didn't fuck that up, and their bond was further cemented. October 1991. David and Susan's son, Michael, was born. As a newborn, Michael had little of value to offer the world besides a few more gallons of sewage, much like his mother. Susan and David loved their son very much, but not each other. David was thinking above the waist for a change. Perhaps it was because the newly expanded entrance to her uterus was now accessible by bus. There was enough room for football teams, present and former members. It could have sheltered the homeless in most major cities. Okay, maybe I exaggerated a bit. David was in and out of her life and between her legs just as often, for he got her knocked up again when he should have just knocked her out and left her for dead in the middle of the desert with an empty canteen to recycle her own piss as her only means of survival. Unfortunately, she didn't abort this child either, and David returned to the nest because he was honorable like that. He intended to reconcile with Susan because children inspire their parents to make stupid decisions sometimes. They were happy together for a while. They even bought a house together. Susan should have been tied up in the basement with a bucket for a latrine and fed from the floor, but life isn't fair. David couldn't bring himself to love Susan, and, as time would tell, she didn't deserve love. After their son Alex was born, David couldn't stand the bitch anymore and got the fuck out of Dodge. He did remain in the boys' lives as he shared custody. If only he had known that by leaving his sons alone with his ex-wife, he placed them in great peril. Susan couldn't bear to see David at work every day, so she got a job as a bookkeeper at a large firm. She became a secretary for a man named Tom, and after all those years with David, the grocery store employee extraordinaire, she raided Tom's meat department. I don't know if Tom was hung or not, but he was rich, successful, kind, and affectionate, and that's what Susan valued most. Though it was casual for a time, she was in love. Like bent over a toilet and dry heaving because he didn't call love. Though they weren't officially an item, Tom was, shall we say, displeased when they went to a party, and he found her at one point making out with another man in a jacuzzi. He didn't feel betrayed by what he saw her do in the communal sperm bank. He just thought she was a nasty skank with the morals of a $40 cold sore farmer. He very wisely demoted her from his life. He was another guy who didn't want kids and especially didn't want to raise another man's spawn, though he wished her well. October 25th, 1994. Tragic news emerged on this day. Susan Smith was still alive. This was especially troublesome for her sons. At 8 a.m., she buckled Michael and Alexander into their car seats instead of getting into the car alone and driving into a brick wall, because life isn't fair. She was still devastated about losing Tom because she couldn't keep her whore legs closed in that punch bowl of disease called a jacuzzi. The cunt was feeling sorry for herself and decided to take her own life. That's the spirit. For some reason, her original destination was her mother's house. It would have been a good idea to leave the kids with their grandmother so Susan could kill herself. Instead, she drove to a lake. She parked the car on a dock. She put the car in drive, got out, and released the parking brake. This is the part where you'll understand why I've written such unflattering material about her. As she stood watching, the car advanced several feet and onwards to the middle of the lake, where it gradually sank, taking Michael and Alexander down to where she belonged. Susan ran to a house nearby and asked the occupant to call the police. Her ridiculous story was that she was driving down the road with the boys when all of a sudden a large black man, out of her most racist nightmares, got into the car and ordered her to drive. After they drove around for a while, he told her to pull over and get out. When she did, he drove off with the two boys because nothing makes a stolen car look legit like two toddlers who are clearly not yours. Susan gave several press conferences where she asked for the return of her sons and counted on the prejudices of strangers to believe that a black guy took her kids when he stole her car. No other man wanted the kids besides David, so why would this guy take them? Susan was interviewed by police several times, and discrepancies began to emerge. She was wrong about a traffic light, saying it was red when in fact it is usually green. She and David took polygraph tests. David passed his, but Susan's results were inconclusive. Did she tell herself it wasn't she who killed the kids, but the water? That's one way to rationalize. There is no way to know if that is true, because life is unfair. Anyway, she was confronted by police with the holes in her story, to which she broke down and confessed to what she had done. The car was pulled out of the lake. It was upside down, and the boys were still strapped into their car seats, like a morbid, satirical illustration of a family car ride from the cover of a Black Flag album. The autopsy revealed that Alexander and Michael were alive when they died, having drowned. Susan Smith was found guilty of murder. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison, where she can find love with Big Bertha, who will have her wiping her ass with cotton balls and finger-banging other inmates for cigarettes. Whether or not she finger-banged jailhouse lesbians, she did catch a sexually transmitted disease after sleeping with 2 guards. Sometimes life is fair after all. Mother number 9, Megan Huntsman. Megan Huntsman was in love with a man named Darren West. She was also in love with drugs. She was with Darren for about 10 years. Drug addiction for many people is forever. Darren was no stranger to drugs either. He was in and out of prison for years because of drug-related charges. Supposedly, Megan cheated on Darren when he was not at home. Darren was good for other things besides using drugs, among them home improvements. He opened an electrical box one day and was surprised to find a dead baby. It sure was a change of pace from finding change in the sofa. Darren called police and they went to the residence to investigate. During their search, they found 6 more babies in the garage. Obviously, that was a point at which an officer got on his radio and said, "I think we've got a problem here." Some were stored in boxes, while others were wrapped in blankets and shirts. While Darren Jr. was believed to be stillborn, the others appeared to have been suffocated shortly after their births. Ever hear of an IUD, lady? It appeared, based on autopsy results, that the murders occurred over 10 years. Both Megan and Darren were interviewed, and Darren was cleared as a suspect, though police thought it was odd that he was not cognizant of the presence of 7 dead babies in his home. Megan confessed to killing the babies. She said she couldn't remember how many babies she had killed, assuming the tally to be 8 or 9. Megan had 3 other children who were unharmed. She said she was addicted to meth and was not fully aware of the implications of her behavior. She also said that she had the babies with other men and was afraid of how Darren would feel if he found out about them. Later, paternity tests were performed on all the babies, and Darren was found to be the father. Megan faced 5 years to life for each infanticidal act, but because of a Utah state law, she was eligible for the death penalty. Mother number 13, the hard luck number, Jeanette Hawes. November 2007. Jeanette Hawes stopped with her 2 children at a convenience store, a regular occurrence in their lives. The clerk recognized Jeanette and usually knew her to be in good spirits. That day she came across as detached, definitely not herself. That wasn't the last abnormal thing to happen at the store. If only drinking toilet duck had been the epitome of her bizarre behavior that day. Taking her 2 children into the bathroom was a little unorthodox, especially when both children began to cry. The clerk heard a strange sound, then silence. She knocked on the washroom door. Jeanette would not answer. The clerk called the police. The police officers knocked on the door. When Jeanette didn't answer, they broke down the door. What they found when they entered the room was Jeanette on the floor crying. Her children were both dead on the floor. Jeanette was awash in their blood. She had stabbed them both with a steak knife. Jeanette was arrested. According to the clerk, as she was led out of the store, she was completely unemotional. like she scrubbed out every last vestige of her love for her children with toilet duck. She didn't even really seem to realize where she was, actually. She did smile for her mugshot, though. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity and admitted to a psychiatric hospital. Years later, she told a judge she deserved a release because the treatment she received in the hospital had changed her. The judge didn't buy it, and she remains incarcerated to this day, so she cannot be a blemish on a society that would be better served if her presence were scrubbed off with toilet duck. Toilet duck. Great product name. They better be grateful for the plug because I ain't getting paid for that. Mother number 14, Michelle Kehoe. Michelle had a history of mental illness as confirmed by a psychologist and her murder of her 2 sons. Both her parents were alcoholics. It is not stated whether she suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome, but it is within the realm of possibility. Her parents separated when she was 4, and her father died when she was 6, having been spared the fate of seeing what she would become years later. Her mother married a pedophile without realizing it, a pedo who sexually abused Michelle for 6 years. Michelle could only take it for so long, and she told her mother. Mother of the Year responded not by reporting her husband to the police, but by sending Michelle to live with her aunt. If there is a hell, there is a special place there for parents who punish their children for reporting sexual abuse. Over the long term, this proved to be a blessing in disguise, for Michelle enjoyed life with her aunt. However, Michelle began to suffer from depression, a common complication of sexual abuse. She was put on antidepressants, but they were not effective. There were many failed suicide attempts. Slacker. Michelle had a baby during this time of her life. She had several miscarriages, too. Loser. She had a second baby. With each pregnancy, her depression intensified. Speculation had it that postpartum depression exacerbated the garden variety depression she suffered from. 2007, Michelle was driving with her children and back in winter when her car skidded out of control and drove into an ice bank. Now she suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. October 26, 2008. Proving Michelle Kehoe was worse at mothering than she was at driving, she took a knife and stabbed all 3 of her sons. I just Googled the phrase, "I regret having children." I got 138 million results in 0.43 seconds. The majority of those parents will tell you that though they love their brats, they wish they had been left behind as a wet spot beneath a towel. Or in the case of men, encrusted on a black dress sock that makes a tick-like sound when you drop it on the floor. Perhaps if Michelle had read the accounts by those parents, she might have felt better about parenting her burdens. Her youngest son, Seth, was killed, while the other suffered grievous bodily harm with complicated feelings about women to follow in the years to come. Michelle slashed her own throat with enough force that she injured her windpipe. Hospital staff were able to save her oldest son, Sean. Unfortunately, Michelle also survived. During her trial, Michelle admitted that the accident in 2007 was actually an attempt at murder-suicide. She tried for an insanity defense based on her long history with depression. The jury was about as sympathetic to her as she was to her children as she slashed them with a knife. They found her guilty of murder and attempted murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. All her appeals were rejected. Mother number 15, Deanna Laney. Deanna Laney thinks she's pretty goddamn special. Like if the sun burned out tomorrow, she could open her legs and illuminate our beautiful world with a supernova in her crotch. She was an Instagram narcissist before Instagram existed. How narcissistic and self-obsessed was she? Well, she believed that she was a daughter of God. Technically, religions teach their adherents that all people are children of God, but apparently Deanna thought she was God's equivalent of Marcia on the Brady Bunch. She saw herself as embodying everything that was righteous, and that it was her mission to rid the world of evil. She felt that her children should not be spared. The Bible said that Abraham killed his son to demonstrate his loyalty to God, so you could deflect some of the blame to Christianity. Remember Andrea Yates? Deanna did too, and she admired her for killing her children. She definitely would have followed her on Instagram and even DM'd her. She understood where she was coming from. Deanna is one of those people who think they see signs from God everywhere. The ketchup French fry streaks on a dinner plate, a muffin, a litter box. Those are some examples I made up, but they are plausible enough when considering the subject of this profile. She claimed the signs she saw were urging her to kill her children. No second opinion. One day Deanna observed as her 14-month-old son played. He picked up a spear at one point. He played with it, which bothered Deanna for some reason. She's white, so she didn't interpret it as the racial epithet spear chucker. Still, she was crazy enough to be offended by this. Up until then, Deanna resisted the call to kill her children. She decided not to put it off any further, since, as she put it, doing it at a later date would only feel worse, and getting it over with would relieve her of those feelings. Like a Band-Aid. Right off! Aaron, the youngest, had the dubious honor of being killed first. She went into his bedroom and dropped a large, heavy stone on his head. It broke his skull. It didn't kill him, but he did cry from the excruciating pain. Her husband, Keith, asked what was going on from the master bedroom. Deanna told him everything was okay and to leave her alone. Usually when somebody tells you to leave them alone, all is not okay in their world. But Keith believed her and went to sleep. Aaron couldn't stop crying from having been bludgeoned, so Deanna used that time-tested technique of smothering him with a pillow to shut him up. She told God she couldn't continue with the murder. He never asked her to in the first place, but she told him he would have to finish Aaron off because she sure as shit can delegate. Next up was 6-year-old Josh. She took him out to the backyard, and instead of looking up at the cosmos, she had him seeing stars when she clouted him in the head with a stone until she broke his skull. She didn't stop striking him until he was dead, and her reservation in hell was secured. She pulled him into the shadows and left him there. She left the rock on his body. Next, it was 8-year-old Luke's turn. What great evils did these kids commit anyway? The temptations of chewy Chips Ahoy, running in the house, not cleaning their rooms, bad grades, picking their noses at wedding receptions. She got Luke out of bed and did her utmost to pound the evil out of him with a rock, as she did with the other kids. She called the police and told them she killed her sons instead of calling them beforehand and asking them to take her to a psychiatric hospital so the murders could be prevented. Aaron survived, but he incurred irreversible brain damage. Psychiatrists diagnosed Deanna as having suffered from a psychotic disorder. She was placed on antipsychotic medication and recovered. With newfound clarity came the shock and remorse of realizing she murdered and assaulted her children. She was devastated. The prosecution felt that she was in charge of her faculties at the time of her attacks on the children because of how methodical she was, and that she was lucid enough to contact the police afterwards. There was also no known history of psychiatric illness aside from what she reported after the crimes. The jury did find her not guilty by reason of insanity. She resides in a maximum security psychiatric institution. May 15th, 2012. Deanna was released, albeit under some very strict conditions and supervision. She is no longer considered dangerous. Keith divorced her and refuses to see or talk to her. Keith has raised Aaron as a single father. Aaron requires assistive care and is unable to live independently. He wears diapers, braces on his feet, and cannot even feed himself or brush his teeth. At least on an intellectual level, he is on an even par with his mother. Mother number 16, Sabine Rademacher. Sabine Rademacher did many things that were truly terrible. Did she wipe her after-dinner hands off on a Mickey Mouse sweatshirt worn by a girl with Down syndrome? No, that would just be rude. Sabine behaved like Bjork after a peanut butter and PCP sandwich. A lot of babies have died in Germany, most of them during World Wars I and II. September 19th, 2010, Lörrach, Germany. It came to light that Sabine Rademacher had a 5-year-old son, and she was just not that into him. So she knocked him unconscious and put a bag over his head as a means to suffocate. She was estranged from his father, who came by the apartment that day to pick up his son. She greeted him with 2 gunshots, one to his head and the other to his neck. She followed up by stabbing him. Next, she set fire to the apartment by lighting nitrocellulose paint thinner, which is highly flammable. The fire led to an explosion. 17 people suffered smoke inhalation. Sabine was a one-woman riot, visiting anarchy on her neighborhood. She walked down the street with a .22 caliber pistol in one hand and a knife in the other. She crossed the street to St. Elizabeth Hospital. Upon entering the hospital, she shot 2 random individuals. Sabine made her way to the gynecology ward. There, she shot and stabbed a male nurse. She shot 2 visitors and a police officer who happened to be there, injuring all 3. When more officers were dispatched to the scene, Sabine shot at them. A gunfight ensued. Over 100 rounds of ammunition were collected at the scene. It is unclear what triggered Sabine's rage. Her colleagues at the law firm where she worked as an attorney recalled that she was distressed and resentful about the outcome of a relationship and child custody dispute. The father had full-time custody while the child spent weekends with Sabine. Neighbors have said that her son's father got together with another woman, which upset Sabine greatly. One neighbor said, "She seems not to have got over the fact that the son lived with the father. She had lost everything, her husband, her child, and her home. But I would never have thought she was capable of something like this." Here's hoping that Mother's Day 2023 was a pleasant occasion for you and your mom, if she is still alive. If not, I suppose you could dig her up and make furniture out of her skin like Ed Gein. I hope your mother didn't ruin your life. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.